Today, we're talking about prayer apps and data mining. And this is after several reports have emerged of prayer app companies using personal data, which they sell on to advertisers, in the process making millions, which seems to go against the grain somewhat of prayer, where only God is meant to be listening and who is freely accessible to all. So how widespread is this, and will users trust prayer apps in the future? Our guests are Emma Holland from Pray As You Go, the Jesuit prayer app, Andrew Brown, a reporter and commentator with us at the Religion Media Centre, Beth Singler, research fellow, Maria Farrell, a writer and speaker on technology, and Dr. Jason Pridmore from the Erasmus School in Rotterdam. And there'll be a greater introduction to all as we go along. But Emma, just to start with you first of all, for those who maybe have never used a prayer app, just tell us a little bit more about Pray As You Go. What is it, in fact? What do people get when they click on your app?
Sure. Well, thanks for having us. It's great to be here. So Pray As You Go actually started in 2006 as a podcast. So way before apps were even a thing, back when podcasts were just starting up themselves. And the idea behind it was just a simple way for people to pray on their commute. So for like 10 to 13 minutes with a bit of music, a bit of scripture and some reflection time as well. And obviously since then it's evolved. We then had a website where people could download zip files and take us with them on MP3 players. And in 2013, we sort of joined and jumped on the bandwagon of apps because we thought this would be a really good idea. It would sort of mirror exactly what we wanted to do, was to help people pray wherever they are and just have that small space with God. Since then, people have started using it in the comfort of their homes, in their bedrooms, for people who are housebound as well. It's become a really important tool. And similarly, in prisons and things, it's been very important.
How many people use the app?
So that question in itself is quite difficult because we can tell who's using the app. We can see how many downloads we've had. We can see who's using the website, for example. And that's roughly around 100,000 people daily. But however, because we're still also a podcast, we're on things like Spotify, we're on other platforms, which means those statistics are harder to come by. And we also still allow for zip files, which means that people can download our daily prayers and send them out to other people. So we don't track those at all. So in some ways, it's 100,000 daily, but we don't fully know the extent of our users.
And what data do you collect from people?
So this is something that we've been talking about as we develop Pray As You Go. We always wanted to treat our users very tenderly and not transactionally. So we don't collect data beyond significant data that we would ordinarily collect through Google Analytics and necessary cookies. So we don't have a subscription. People don't need to sign up. So we know location, we know vaguely age ranges and gender, but we don't know people's names. We don't have access to their email addresses unless they sign up to hear from us from our newsletters or something like that. So we don't collect anything.
What use do you make, though, of your knowledge of the people who sign up, their IP addresses and so forth?
All we generally want to know is just sort of a vague idea of where our audience are and who they are. So we're aware that a lot of our audience are in the United States, but beyond a sort of general shape of what our audience look like, we feel we don't need to know any data beyond that, beyond sort of interest of who's listening and who it's helping and reaching.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma. We'll come back to you a bit later, I'm sure. But Andrew, perhaps I could turn to you. That all sounds fairly innocuous, actually, and a rather beautiful experience. So what are the concerns? How widespread is the problem?
The thing started with the discovery of Pray.com, which is one of the bigger of these apps. And if you poke around the statistics on the Google App Store, which I was doing, these things have downloaded more than 5 million times. That's the bucket between 5 and 10 million, and then you go up to 50 million. None of them appear to have been downloaded 50 million times, but 5 million is quite a lot. And they have built into the app what's called an SDK, which is just a little sort of sub-program which collects lots of data of use to advertisers. they supplement their own information, and this is quoting from their privacy policy, your gender, age, religious affiliation, ethnicity, marital status, household size and income, political party affiliation and interests, geographical location, and personal information, which they can share with third parties, again, a quote for quotes, commercial purposes. Essentially, they're doing what almost everybody else in this business does, which is to collect information which is, roughly speaking, de-anonymized, and then combined by data brokers, especially in America, with a whole bunch of other information, the sort of data exhaust, as people say, that you leave behind you, which ends up giving advertisers practically everything they'd like to know about you except your name. And the problem, there are further problems with Muslim prayer apps, which are designed, apart from anything else, they have to tell you which way to point towards Mecca, which means they have to know where you are.
There was an allegation made that one of the apps, Muslim Pro, used this for counterterrorism, which it vigorously denied. But by that time, it had lost millions of subscribers. How would you know if your information was being data mined in that way?
You wouldn't. Well, I mean, you can read the privacy policy, but these are written in incredibly vague ways, and with lots and lots of loopholes. And I downloaded the privacy policy of pray.com and Glorify, which was an app that raised $40 million in funding the other day, Glorify. And now, you know, if venture capitalists give you $40 million, they're going to expect at least 80 back. And that is going to be made almost either from in-app purchases, and that's not really a viable model for these prayer apps. They all of them charge a subscription. You know, you're paying about £50 a year for these, and they tend to, but they can't, in the nature of things, offer the kind of continuous upselling that games do. I suppose you could say assurance of salvation, that'll be another $100, but they don't work like that. If they can't do that, it has to come out of advertising.
Can I bring in Maria Farrell at this point? Maria, you're a writer and speaker on technology. It says on your profile here that you've worked in technology policy for 20 years. What are your misgivings about prayer apps?
I think there are probably two things that I would be concerned about. You know, I'm happy enough with these guys. I've looked at their privacy policies. They're not great, but they're standard. They don't respect European privacy law, for example, under which religion, the fact of which religion you are, if you are any, is a sensitive data and effectively a protected characteristic. They don't respect that, but so that's kind of not great. But I think from the market point of view, within the app stores, you have a couple of different things going on. One is sort of ground up, we're a religious community and here's our manifestation in the real, in the app store. But then you also have lots of Me Too products, which are basically take and copy the templates of existing prayer applications and use them as basically ways to hoover up data. Some of it, you know, obviously using protected characteristics. And then also you have particularly because so much of this market is dominated by American prayer apps, you have the what I would consider is the very malign influence of the American hard right evangelical politics and, you know, social attitudes, and they do tend to, you know, use this stuff for as far as you can tell, for recruiting, for proselytization, and you know, they're sort of one of the early and original channels for kind of pro-Trump, hard right American, you know, racist, various forms of nastiness. So they are a channel for that. But
sorry to interrupt. Were you shocked when you discovered all this? I mean, when you first dipped your toes in this, because you've been, you know.
I was not, but I think I've just been in tech policy too long to be all that shockable. In that, you know, I knew when I signed up for an app that it was going to be under American data protection laws, which basically don't exist. And so, you know, I tried to find one that didn't have an obvious economic incentive to drain and exploit the maximum of data from me.
Bringing in Beth Singler. Beth, you're a research fellow in artificial intelligence at Homerton College, Cambridge. Just can I ask you to reflect on Maria's observations there, and just ask what research you may have done on prayer apps in particular, and how concerned you are?
Yeah, so I think following on from Maria's comments, that what we're seeing that is very specific to this time, that's different to the longer history you can draw out of the interaction of technology and religion, that technology enables religion to communicate at greater and greater speeds. And we've seen that trend over the period of time, from textual communications to the internet to the burgeoning of apps and the presence of social media. What I would say specifically is different to this moment, that ties into what Maria was saying, is the effect of algorithmic systems behind the scenes on social media apps that inform and enforce correlations. So if you present yourself in a particular space in a particular way, the data that you are providing is then shaping the experience that you're having. So absolutely, with the suggestion of the influence of hard-right evangelical Christian voices in this space, not only in the performance of these apps and their sources and their themes, but also in the investment in them as well, that specifically certain people being involved. We're actually seeing this shaping social media effect having an influence on how people find like-minded communities and how they stay in them and how those communities grow and develop. So for religions more generally, that's kind of an amplifying effect of previous elements of their life cycle, the way that they emerge, the way they grow, the way they schism. But we're seeing that push with the value system of algorithms to more and more fringe and stronger ideologies because of this sort of attention economy effect, that these apps formulate their success by having people look at them. And that goes back to what Andrew was saying about the role of advertising as well, that so many of these platforms are free to users, but then it's making the users the product. Again, as we've seen on other internet formats, that advertising is actually the way that these apps are going to make money.
Can I ask one kind of slightly pointed question? Is it possible, do you reckon, that the actual content of your prayers is then used to influence what you see on Facebook, say?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely some people's very personal experience of sharing difficult times in their lives, not on the apps necessarily that we've mentioned so far, but some of the other ones that allow for more social interaction between users. They share something that's happening in their life. That data is then sold to third parties and could turn up in various different locations afterwards. We do see a lot of cross-platform interaction. So if you've ever been on Facebook after searching something on Amazon, sometimes adverts, again, come up for the same sorts of things. The difficulty, therefore, is if we're preying on sensitive subjects, or even for other people who might not have wanted data about their current life circumstance shared, then that becomes part of the bundle of data that we're transmitting.
But to sharpen the question in a way, how personal is it if I'm, I don't know, praying about drug addiction, and this data is shared with advertisers, but not actually with anybody who knows me? It's a slightly different harm, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that the problem is we don't know the boundaries of how far data goes. So yes, it could be shared with advertisers, but also, as the example of Muslim Pro came up earlier, some of that data, and I think it was more than just an allegation, because they confirmed that they had been sharing data with a third-party system, which then sold it on to, I've written down the acronym because I will get it wrong, the USSOCOM, so the US Special Ops Command, that they were looking, as intelligence gatherers do, and they now employ algorithms more and more to do this, looking for correlations. So if you're using a prayer app and you're looking at specific verses, in this case it was Muslim Pro, but it could be any prayer app, and you're looking for specific verses, and someone else who has been involved in nefarious acts also looks at those same verses, a correlation could be highlighted, and you will be, lit up as a person of interest. So that's a concern as well, that your patterns of behavior, if they match someone else's, then you could also be someone who's become significant in an inquiry.
I just want to draw a distinction between targeted specific law enforcement access to data based to support specific investigations, which most people have no problem with, or have in principle no objections to, and for which also there are enormous carve-outs in data protection law. which allow it to take place. But then there's what Beth is talking about, which is trawling through existing forms of data to pools of data to try and basically just kind of free-form trawling through what's available, trying to find profiles, find connections, find people who are not specifically, either individually or as a group suspected of any wrongdoing. So this is not we are fighting terrorism. This is more we are trying to build profiles on a whole population, and that is several magnitudes of orders of harm and problematic, I think, for anyone who's worried about human rights.
Thank you, Maria. Can I just bring in Jason Pridmore now? Jason, you're the Vice Dean in Education at the Erasmus School of History, Culture and Communication at Rotterdam. But you've worked with various academics, I know, in Scotland and Sweden and Canada, I believe, on the whole area of religion and surveillance. Having listened to the conversations so far, what can you contribute about the research that you've done into how religious apps are used in the surveillance industry?
I think there's several points that are really quite interesting here. I think first I wanted to start with one that Beth noted. We shouldn't be surprised that American evangelicals, and especially with a history of fundamentalism, have always been on the cutting edge of new technologies. Actually, in the UK as well. That goes back to the first use of radio for religious purposes, television and cable television. So this is a perpetual history that we are seeing. In terms of the actual monitoring and evaluation of people, some of the comments there that Maria just made as well, and the question from Andrew is that the degree to which the metadata is being used versus sort of very specific, this prayer request connects and correlates with someone else. I think that there's limited use on that, with the exception of, as Maria suggested, sort of targeted, security-focused approaches to determine if certain people are seeing a connection. Much more is about what is the lifestyle, what are the people like, and as Andrew suggested, this is crucial for advertising practices to engage a bit better with their audience. That, for me, is actually the thing that I think we need to keep in mind here. Why do people use a prayer app? What's attractive there? And usually this is something to add to their spiritual life, to sort of participate and engage. And that's the research that I have done with students, and I'm still working on with several. And we've done some surveys on this. And what we notice is that it really is about sort of perpetuating a sense of who you want to be and who you want to act like, and using these technology to nudge you in a certain way to promote a particular set of practices. The issue is that in that process, and this goes with whether you're using Fitbit or some other tracking app, whether that's a diet or menstrual cycle or sort of travel plans, those sorts of things, is that we use them as a tool without actually often asking the critical questions, like Maria did when she chose to use a Jesuit prayer app. And I think that's the challenge. Is always been this ease of access versus is what we are giving away.
Thanks. I mean, I was quite interested in what you said in one of your research articles, that it was something about paternalistic traits that you found in prayer apps. Just explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, so what we found is largely they were in the Bible reading, which I think that's another interesting point, is the relationship, particularly in Christian practice, although I would assume that there's also this in Muslim and other religious practices, about reading or participating in particular practices and then engaging in prayers. And what we found is largely there is a push to use these tools again as a reminder. What was limited at the time, and this is what might be really interesting because it was well before COVID when we did the study, is how much things have changed since then. But the social aspect, the let's share prayer requests or let me share a scripture, a verse with you, was quite limited at the time, at least in our survey. And I think that's a question is how much that has changed. And then that dynamic also can create another sort of set of data that becomes interesting. Where do people cluster, and what do they cluster around?
I'm interested a bit in the question of whether the pandemic will have accelerated the formation of communities around these apps. Do you have any opinion around this? I mean, because they're not just personal prayer apps. Quite a lot of them go in for discussion boards and people forming ad hoc online communities. But has this accelerated in the last few years?
Again, most of this is anecdotal that I have seen, at least in research. I do have a student actually asking some of those questions now. But I think we have seen a lot more facilitation of some social processes and connection. Churches, for instance, making use of different tools that are already on an app. And that's also the thing that I think when we talk about any of these apps, whether it's the Glorify or, any ones that may be more questionable, they're often done in relationship to others. So I may scroll and evaluate, okay, which app is most reliable, which ones do I trust? But usually it's coming from a personal relationship with somebody else. It may be a pastor or it may be a friend that says, oh, I'm using this. And maybe, hey, we should pray together more often. And that's the incentive. And that's the top level incentive versus sort of the layers below, which might be like, wait a minute, what's happening with my data? Where's this information going? And I think it is about sustaining those communities a bit more than it is, at least the way most people have approached it, than critically assessing the technology itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, there's a scripture verse in Matthew 6 that talks about going into your room and closing the door and praying in private and talking to God. So we sort of use that quite a lot as a model, particularly during the pandemic. I think, just to go back to what Jason was saying, from the statistics we did have, we saw an enormous kind of jump in the analytics that we had, almost doubling the use during the pandemic. And for us, we were tailoring content very much for the situation. So we were providing prayer resources specifically for healthcare workers, for children and families within who were experiencing lockdown together, and helping them to find ways to pray privately. I think when we think about other prayer apps, looking into data and looking at mining a little bit more into that, for us, it's a bit intrusive because it's sort of adding someone into your digital room with God, which we didn't really want to go near. So we also created sort of a community, an online community called Imagine during lockdown to kind of enhance that experience where users could talk to each other. So we did a weekly Zoom sort of check-in with people, but again, no data collected unless they wanted to sign up. So that community experience existed, but also we maintained that personal experience. For a Jesuit app, we mirror very much the original vision of Saint Ignatius Loyola, who created the spirituality, which was to spiritually accompany people and to provide a space for a spiritual conversation between them and God. So what we're doing really, we hope, is a kind of digital reflection of that physical origin of the spirituality to be a helpful tool or a helpful accompaniment for people's journey.
I just wanted to follow up quickly on Emma's point about not wanting to make a sort of intermediary between believers and their faith, that some forms of prayer apps, broadly construed, actually do use artificial intelligence as a user interface. So you can get the downloadable Alexa skill from the Church of England onto your Amazon Alexa, which obviously has its own privacy issues. But that, again, is using artificial intelligence as a step between what you want to get to. So you as the user have to ask for something, and then the AI understands the words and provides it. So there's that sort of suggestion for some people that is removing believers one step further away from the object of their faith. So I can see with Emma's app, she's saying how she doesn't want that kind of intermediary experience, but for some people, that's what they're having. So they're having that stage in between as well.
Can I just ask you to clarify that? I haven't come across an app that does it. Just describe what happens actually, Beth. So you say to God, or you say to your app, I'm in distress, make me feel peaceful or something. And then what happens?
Yeah, it's not quite framed like that. So if you know Alexa, obviously you can make requests of Alexa, and you can request basic things like play me my favorite song, which is so-and-so. So you're making a linguistic demand, and the AI within Alexa understands that and follows through. What the Church of England provided a couple of years ago now, so you can see their advertising videos online of how it works, is broadly that you can download this optional extra for Alexa. So you can say to Alexa, could you say the Lord's Prayer, or could you say grace, I'm about to have dinner. So it's very clearly described in some of the literature and the press releases around it that this is not Alexa praying for you, but it's that one step removed of, I don't necessarily say the Lord's Prayer, I'm asking Alexa to say it. The idea is that perhaps that helps you to learn the Lord's Prayer, but it's still a recorded voice. I don't think they actually even use Alexa's voice. They have pre-recorded separate voices for it. But a recorded voice that says the Lord's Prayer on your behalf when you request it.
But do any of them actually have the voice of God coming back to you saying, yes, I give you my blessing or whatever?
I would pay money for that app.
I think that's slightly beyond the scope of the technology at the moment, as I understand it. But some of my research as an anthropologist is about looking at our conceptions of artificial intelligence and where we make this kind of leap into seeing the non-transparent algorithm as godlike. So having the power and authority to make decisions over our lives and leaving us with the feeling that in some way we've been blessed by this thing behind the scenes that's making decisions. So you can see for some people, their tendency to anthropomorphize actually becomes sort of demorphization. That's not really a word, deification. So they actually end up thinking of this behind the scenes AI as a disembodied godlike figure. So I don't think that's at all what they're going for with the Church of England Alexa skill, but it's just, again, it's AI as a user interface, which is something in general society we're getting more and more used to. If you call up your bank, often, the first step might be an automated voice system before you get to a human, or you interact with a chatbot or so forth. So that kind of technology in the religious setting raises questions about how far we are distanced from the human-to-human interaction that we might expect from a religious situation.
Yeah, Beth, I was going to ask you that so far the discussion's been remarkably Christian-heavy, but are there analogues to this in kind of non-Christian religions?
So sometimes there's an assumption that what we might call the karmic faiths from Eastern societies, Far Eastern societies, might have a different position on artificial intelligence and technology as being a part of their cosmology of beings. And sometimes that's a large generalization. We also see in other religious groups, obviously we've mentioned Muslim Pro. Recently I discussed on another podcast about, there's a model called Lior Cole, who's also a computer scientist, and she's been working on what she calls Robo-Rabbi, which is a system, again, that you can receive information about Talmudic ideas and concepts when you interact with it. So again, in some ways, basic language systems with artificial intelligence, but again, providing information for people who are seeking answers. And there's various different robot priests out there at the moment. You can see Mindar in Japan. There's sort of elements of technology at the forefront of where we're going, being adopted by religions wanting to demonstrate that they are progressive and want to adapt and adopt technology as well.
Can I just say, I think it's really fascinating the way just listening to everyone, I'd never properly thought about how there sort of tend to be two kind of almost like forms of religious practice at the individual level. Like the one is the individual, personal, contemplative, one-on-one relationship with God, or God's plural, what have you, which is harder to monetize. It doesn't create a lot of good data. And then you've got you need to interact with people, you need to, come to our forum, join our dating website, for a low introductory cost, people of the same religion as you, and all of that is much more easily monetized. The kind of the extrovert, the way people, again, in a slightly Christian thing, but the way you go to church for communion, which is not just the thing that you eat, or whatever you believe about it, but the fact that you go and practice religion with other people and are sort of lifted up by being them, and that the sum of you is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of your parts, all of that. And it just is fascinating to me how the app versions of religion, each kind of reflect that. But the introverted one is definitely, it feels to me like it is, something that religious orders or groups want to do to subsidize effectively. They're not making a lot of money from it. And whereas the other one is, we're upselling you, our hard right politics, or your ability to date within the in-group, or all of those things. We want to keep you coming and interacting and generating data.
So you mean there's a business motive to have an app in the first place? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and well, in that some of them are going to make you money, and there's some of them are going to make you converts, and they're not necessarily all the same thing.
Should it be outlawed or banned or regulated, or should there be more of an outcry about that?
I think we have to assume people are grown-ups in a way. I don't love some of the abuses of data, but I think they fall under a larger panoply of this is how data is abused, and that is wrong, and we should make and apply laws. I think maybe where things become tricky is that, prayer feels really personal. And to discover that what is personal is not necessarily private in data terms or in communications technology terms is a blow and an unwelcome surprise for many people. It's like a category error. I think via this app, I am talking to God, and it's really important to me. My app, my Jesuit app that I don't want to oversell. I probably check into it once a month. I'm not going to oversell this, but when they say, on their website that we are never ever going to use the email you sent requesting prayer for your prayer request, we are not going to use that. I completely believe them, because they're who they are. But for most people, who haven't done their due diligence and haven't worked in tech for 20 years and have just signed up with for an app that's been astroturfed into the top 10 of the App Store on that particular afternoon that they're looking, they may well have an unwelcome surprise, because what they thought was personal is not private, and that's not what people are expecting. And I think that's why you get this push for we must do something. It's because it's an uncomfortable feeling, that comes when something is not what we thought it was.
But Jason, I think, would argue that most people simply don't care.
I think that is the case. I think the bigger issue here is also thinking about where the platforms lie on this and how they can benefit to some degree. And again, back to your point about advertising for those that choose to go that route. I think I don't think any of us or most of us do not have a lot of time, regardless of what kind of app it is, to look into the business model behind it, because that is a bigger question. And let's be honest, the most people who are producing many of these apps are coming from a decent place. They want the support for themselves, and they want to see it for other people. I think Emma's giving an example of that in this particular context. But I think there are nefarious or difficult actors that of course they need to pay for the work that they're doing, and so then they choose the easiest route, which may be to make use of advertising.
Yes, I was delighted to discover when I was poking around this subject that one of the 5 or 10 million selling Muslim prayer apps, and it was big in Saudi, it was one of the top downloads there, is actually produced by a bunch of programmers in Kiev in the Ukraine, who are not, one assumes, Muslims, and whose other products are all, there's a PDF scanner, there's all kinds of stuff. But you see a gap in the market and you make something pretty and you jump in and you've made some money.
Prayer lists have existed in churches for millennia, right? A long time. And routinization of our spirituality is something that I think lends itself well to technology. I think Beth's point about this, I think the human-to-human contact and relationship, well, I think we do need to broaden that out a bit to understand that we've always sort of seen technology as somehow part of this, and whether that technology is a written text. This is a different way of responding. And I think that's the question that I think we need to ask, is where do apps fit with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely you can make an argument it was ever thus. If you look at the long history of religion and technology, even back before the printing press, which I know came up in the comments, that, the simplest thing of votive candles. it publicly demonstrates that you're praying. It requires, in some cases, a donation. So you've got that financial aspect as well. It's just that it's so much more amplified. Plus, a prayer list doesn't look back at you in the way that the algorithms are prepared to do. That you are broadcasting with a prayer list, and yes, your community can look and see how good you've been, and it's almost quantifiable in the same way. But it's not then shaping an image of you that's almost a digital twin that's being used for other purposes. And that interactivity with, I mean, I don't like to personify AI too much with the algorithm or whatever you want to refer to these systems as, but the fact that it is set up to absorb your information and do something with it is an interactivity that doesn't exist in those textual forms that we've had throughout history, laying a votive candle, having a prayer wheel, all these forms of technology that don't even have to get as far as the printing press.
I've got a question here that's come in the chat box. I don't know who wants to take this, which says, where in history has there been something similar to this use of the personal in relation to prayer? Were indulgences misused? Maria, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I was actually, I refrained from making a cheap shot about indulgences when Jason was talking about gamification and moving up the league tables. Yeah, of course. I mean, but I think this comes to, something Beth was talking about, which, yes, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, the oldest prayer app is like one of these guys, which is, we've had them forever. But what is different is both scale and intent. And the technology, based on an advertising model of internet provision, makes it not just possible, but to some is unavoidable in our current setup. That data is going to be scraped, and it will be used potentially at cross purposes to people's original intents. It will be used in contexts which they did not agree to and would not wish, and yes, can absolutely be used, in quite instrumental ways against people. So,
but Maria, could I ask what we can do, what the individual can do if they feel the urge to install a prayer app, they find it helpful? Do they simply not use the apps if they don't want to run the risk of data being mined?
So just to take the pure consumerist thing, probably do what I did, which is, start from first principles of what is the religious community I'm interested in? Do they have some presence in, let's say, the App Store? That's probably the best, consumer focused way to find a reasonably decent app that's not going to be too manipulative, because there are, copycat apps. I mean, there are hundreds and thousands of them created every day. So probably try and find something that's grounded in real life in a community that you want. But that, individual solutions don't solve structural problems. But that's a broader question about ad click and surveillance.
If it is a structural problem, is there a structural answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Burn the internet to the ground. The current version of it is a completely historically contingent and market-based set of choices that say we cannot possibly have an internet unless we use the version of it that was, invented circa 2008. That basically says you can have anything you want, but you have to allow us to surveil you and build profiles of you and sell that data to other people to do whatever they like with. And some of those people will be annoying advertisers, some of them will be monopolistic companies, that do all sorts of damage to the economy. And some of them will be abusive authoritarian regimes who can, shape and harm and end your life. So it's, this is part of a very, very bigger question, which is we do not have to live in ad click world, but we're currently presented with it as something that's immutable.
If we move somewhere at the level of granularity between change the whole internet model and work as a consumer, are there any particular practices in this sphere that any of you, all of you, think particularly dangerous? Which uses of prayer apps do you think are just legitimate extensions of what has always gone on, and which uses are possibly just sinister?
I mean, it's possible we could take something from the interception and surveillance regimes in most countries, which draw a distinction between metadata and communications, the content of communications data. So metadata is less damage to people. The content of their communications does tend to destroy their privacy much more and their autonomy.
Yeah.
So, for example, not sending actual contents of your prayers to a random website or app, that strikes me as...
But all these places deny that they actually do that. They presumably say you are interested in such and such and so and so, and especially if you make a granular offering of things you can pray about or get help about, that's very revealing about what's troubling you.
I think that's the issue. Is I don't think we're going to see granular offerings. So this, in my other world, this has been about consumer surveillance practices, and your Tesco Club card knows that if they offer you things too specific, it gets really creepy. And I don't think we will see that happen in that way. They will package it in a larger way where it's one item amongst many that you probably are interested in. But this is also one of the things that is a challenge here, because even though we've created, and we talk about it as platform capitalism or surveillance capitalism, and part of the other issue is we have very few platforms. We end up with this juxtaposition of the concern for myself that somebody knows these intimate things about me and can act on that, versus the reality, which is most companies just don't care. They care about you in a very broad swath, and they care to use the knowledge that they have to move their advertising response rate from 4% to 4.1%. And if they do that, they're quite happy that they've targeted you a little bit better because they happen to know that you have this religious proclivity and relationships with others.
And this, to sharpen the point, is a huge difference from the kind of relationship that people think they have with a personal God, where he really does care about you as a specific individual and not as a part of an advertisable mass. So, I mean, Beth, where would you draw the line, as it were? What is it that seems to you to shade from stuff happens into actual abuse, which we should be trying to prevent?
Well, it's so amorphous and nebulous. I completely understand why people cannot trace absolutely everything that is happening on these apps and finding what are suitable apps and what aren't. But you've got to think, I mean, I'm not approaching this from someone who particularly prays, but you've got to approach this from the perspective of what is it specifically that I want the app to do. If it's just to remind you regularly to pray, set an alert on your phone. You don't have to necessarily adopt a whole platform, which, again, I mean, the point was made earlier, and I think it's a very good point, that the driving force for some people for going on these forms of apps is about demonstrating identity, like being in a space with similar people of a similar identity. And one thing that hasn't come up, and I think is also something that we need to think about going forward, and a lot of it's driven by hype, but the push towards more virtual reality spaces, where, again, these issues of people presenting identity, being in particular spaces, sharing their data with both the artificial environment, which itself is an AI system, and artificial agents within this so-called metaverse, is only going to, again, as we talk about acceleration and amplification, cause greater and greater problems if people want to be virtually online in more and more ways to do their religious behaviors. So that's something else that we should take on board. But I just want to go back very quickly to Maria's point about burning down the internet. We have to also, which, if only we could, but I mean, people are selling that as a narrative. I'm not saying Maria's doing this at all, but people are selling burning down Web 2 at the moment to create Web 3. They are proclaiming this will be ultimately very different to the system that is sucking in all your data and doing this kind of client services approach. And what is coming with Web 3 and its emphasis on blockchain is in some ways worse. Sorry?
Sorry, I said much worse.
Much worse. I was being, polite maybe, but yeah, it's much worse in some ways. So it's fair to say we have a problem with the systems that we have now. They are driven by capitalism in particular ways. But what's coming is driven by like a hyper-capitalism, but it's not selling itself in that way. So we have to be very careful with those kinds of narratives as well.
Jason, do you have a final comment as we wrap this very interesting conversation up?
I was going to go on Beth's notion of the artificial intelligence and how that may be being used. of course, we know that in the EU, we've started creating these harmonized rules for artificial intelligence and doing this on a very risk-based sort of pyramid structure. At least that's the starting intention. And of course, that's a very particular consumer protection model. But they're at least raising questions that we need to be asking here. And I think, very short response is that within our religious communities, that question of identity that Beth was noting is the one that we need to ask about. Is how do we need technology? When and how do we need technology to help us strengthen, demonstrate, participate, and socialize in relation to other people as part of our religious identity?
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Thank you all for joining the discussion. I'm sure we will return to this. We've got a series on AI coming up at the end of May, so we'll invite you all back again to that. But thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks, Andrew.